So yeah, Laura's actually my inspiration for everything I do in academia. So it's true, I'm very interested in children and young adults Holocaust literature. And I'd always been interested in the graphics, and through this course, visual and verbal portraiture, I've started delving into and researching a little bit, analyzing portraiture of artists who either continued to paint after the war if they survived, or left us these beautiful artifacts of their lives. So I will stop talking now and read my paper. I'm going to share my screen. I just have a small, just a little presentation, and all I have in there are some of the portraits paintings I'll be discussing, just so it'll be easier to engage. The title is Felix Nussbaum, an intentional representation of bios. And basically through this paper, I will provide hopefully a little bit of an analysis of some of his self-portraiture. So I will begin. And also thank you so much, Professor Lewis, for organizing this. I'm very excited to be participating in this panel and in this conference. There is an implicit understanding inherent to publication of linear or non-linear life writing. The finished product will be consumed by an audience, and as consumers of the product, the audience is free to analyze, interpret, and judge the carefully constructed self at the center of the production, and the political and social constructs of the audience become as important as those of the creator. So the act of publication becomes a conundrum for the autobiographer. The careful control the autobiographer wields over the creation of the finished product is lost in the act of publication. The autobiographer publishes, and by doing so shares and thus exposes the carefully curated self to an unknown audience. The ramifications of social and political constructs, as well as the desire to control the publication, can certainly be taken into consideration by the artist or author, who has complete autonomy when creating ideal representations of self, the self that is to be consumed by an audience. However, the lack of control faced by the artist or author, who is forced to create representations of bios during particularly turbulent historical periods, is perhaps just as relevant to the formation of representations of self, life, bios. The remainder of this presentation will focus on self-portraits painted by the German artist Felix Nussbaum. By analyzing self-portraits of the artists, I endeavored to explore the manner in which the lack of agency created by the socio-political climate of the time impacted the progression of Nussbaum's representation of self. Felix Nussbaum was born to an assimilated German Jewish family in Osnabrück, Germany in 1904. He enrolled in art school in Hamburg in 1922. In 1932, he was awarded a scholarship to study in Rome under the auspices of the Berlin Academy of the Arts. By 1933, Nussbaum could no longer deny the impact fascism was having on Europe. He fled Rome and sought refuge in Belgium, where he and his fiancée, Felka Platek, a Polish Jewish artist, remained in hiding until Nussbaum's arrest and internment in Saint Cyprien in 1940. He escaped and managed to return to Belgium, where he and Platek remained in hiding until June 20th, 1944, when both Nussbaum and Platek were arrested, deported to Auschwitz, where they perished. These chronological dates and events only serve to situate the audience within a historical frame. They do little to offer an understanding of the progressive signs of upheaval, trauma, fear, and desolation reflected in Nussbaum's art. Go back. Sorry, I'm just going to have to go back. I've clicked on something. Oh, there we go. My apologies. By situating the paint, Nussbaum painted two Jews, or the interior of the Osnabrück synagogue in 1926. It is not a traditional self-portrait, yet it is highly relevant. The painting serves to situate Nussbaum within the Jewish community, and by doing so offers the audience a glimpse of the tense relationship between Nussbaum the artist and Nussbaum the Jew. Each detail in the painting offers clues about the Jewish community of Osnabrück. The painting invites the viewer into the synagogue, and it is suffused in warm, rich tones of ochres and reds. The perspective Nussbaum uses draws the eye upwards to the inscription above the ark. The chandelier, carved columns, and large menorah attest to the grandeur of the space. Some congregational members are dressed in fashionable top hats, possibly denoting the more secular, affluent members of the congregation, while others stand in white skull caps and long white robes, which are traditionally worn on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year. By situating the painting and the artist in the synagogue on the Day of Atonement, Nussbaum reveals another dimension of self. Nussbaum was a secular Jew. Positioning himself in a synagogue might attest to an acceptance or interest in the cultural aspects of Judaism. He has placed the community members in cantor along the sides of the synagogue and at the back of the synagogue. They are not really near him. They are small, distant, inconsequential figures. Yet there they are, representations of a religion that surround Nussbaum, a community in which he lived, and at the same time, one that was not particularly important to him. Nussbaum has positioned the cantor, wearing a hat, gilded prayer shawl, and holding a prayer book in front of the painting. The man's expression is one of pious contemplation. His lidded eyes glance upward, perhaps in prayer, and he does not appear to be interested in his immediate physical surroundings. This representation of the pious Jew, like the others in the painting, is another piece within the fragments that form Nussbaum's complex identity. The artist has placed himself directly behind this pious man, yet Nussbaum is undoubtedly the central figure of the painting. He gazes directly at the audience. His expression is intent, perhaps angry. He is not interested in prayer or in any of his surroundings. He wears a traditional prayer shawl, yet the way he wears the shawl is not traditional at all. It is wrapped around the artist in a manner that is reminiscent of a large medieval travel cloak. Beneath the shawl, he wears a large black hat. This might be a large skull cap, but there is a stronger possibility that Nussbaum has painted himself wearing the artist's beret, which he wears in some of his later self-portraits. Nussbaum was 22 when he painted this piece, an artist of enormous talent at the beginning of a future which held unlimited potential. Nussbaum's representation of self radiates strength, decisiveness, and perhaps the impetuousness of youth. He situates himself within Judaism, yet he glares outward, wrapped in a travel cloak and artist's beret. The young artist might choose to stay within his own community, or he might choose to leave. From the painting, it appears that he is prepared to sweep out of the synagogue and forge his identity as an artist. The painting portrays all the conflicting shards that form Nussbaum's concept of self and the desire to forge an awareness of the autobiographical self as decentered, multiple, fragmented, and divided against itself in the act of observing and being, and the simultaneous insistence on the presence of an integrated authorial self located in a body, a place, and a time. Nussbaum's continued to forge ahead as an artist despite the unfolding threat of the Nazi regime. He was a prolific painter. He continued to create self-portraits and portraits of self as images of the tumultuous events of the political era in which he found himself. Despite the personal turmoil and displacement he faced, his self-portraits serve as records of a self and reveal a constant search for identity through his art.
Sorry, Nadine,
Yes.
your picture of yourself slipped. Can you get back on
Oh, I don't
camera?
know why it's doing that.
Oh,
Sorry.
do
I
you have
see that.
an icon on the bottom of your screen?
Start video. There I go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Nussbaum's art captures paradoxical constructs of the self. Many of his self-portraits in particular are characterized by a desire to both reveal and conceal, an attempt at reconciling a life with the self and as a result, its powers come from the paradoxes, the interdeterminacy of its sense of reference to the world. The next series of 3 self-portraits he painted in the years 1928, 1935, and 1936 are testaments to the internal and external struggles Nussbaum expressed through his art as he positioned himself against the political conditions of the time. Self-Portrait with Mask, painted in 1928, both reveals and conceals. The piece is a representation of the uncertainty that Nussbaum faces as he attempts to reconcile the many faces which formed representations of self. The background of the painting is a subdued blue. There is no indication as to where the artist is located. There are no clues situating Nussbaum in a place or a time. The artist is clearly the focus of the work. He is decentered, multiple, fragmented, and divided, both in the act of observing and being. In the painting, Nussbaum glances at the viewers from the corner of his eyes. The sideways glance is different from the intense gaze evident in some of his other self-portraits. It is as if he is uncomfortable in the act of being observed. Most telling is the, sorry, again, I'm gonna have to.
You're fine. We're going to hang in with you no matter what. You're stuck with
Here's
us.
the mask. I had a feeling. So this is most telling is the mask hanging loosely. I keep skipping. Hanging loosely. Hanging loosely and obscuring all of Nussbaum's features and expressions apart from his eyes. Despite the ambiguity of the mask, Nussbaum characteristically included symbols which clearly situate him as an artist. In the portrait, he wears the artist's beret and he holds an easel. Nussbaum, the artist, is the subject. As the artist, he is aware the self-portrait would be viewed by the audience, and the artist is the self at the center of this production. The representation of self in this portrait is ambiguous, as it is not clear which aspects of self he is trying to conceal. Yet the painting is also symbolic of the power of self-determination that Nussbaum still possesses. In the painting, Nussbaum simply references himself. There are no other contextual clues. All references and clues point to the multifaceted dimensions of Nussbaum, the man and the artist. The external world is not relevant to him. He alone will choose which aspects of self he may choose to reveal or conceal. Now we go to this one. There we go. Nussbaum painted self-portrait with chiffon in 1935. The self-portrait attests to some of the external forces which Nussbaum is unwillingly forced to contend with due to the political era in which he finds himself. He is clearly the focal point of the painting, yet he has included contextual clues which hint at the external forces that continue to influence his own formation and realization of bios. The background of the painting is a murky green, and there is a dark doorway to the right of the artist. The artist is no longer situated alone with a clear light background, perhaps signifying the murky lack of clarity that Nussbaum faces about his future at this time. The external forces encroaching on his growth as artist and his independent realization of self are lurking in the background. I'm so sorry. My computer for some reason keeps skipping. I'm not going to expand the screen. I'll just stay like this. Yeah. There are also distinct changes. There are also distinct changes in Nussbaum's representation of himself in this painting. His sideways glances downcast. His mouth turns up at the corners, but the expression is not one of happiness. It is an almost apologetic smile. He still paints himself with an artist's beret, and now with a tie, a shirt, and a vest. He is a man, a respectable man, a man who dresses like all other men, and a man who equates himself with others. However, there is now an unusual white cloth that seems to unfurl itself over the artist's left shoulder. The draping of the white item is reminiscent of the draping of a prayer shawl, perhaps symbolic of Nussbaum's conscious realization that in his reality is becoming one of which he has little to no control, a reality in which Jews are reduced to a single dimensional caricature of the Jew. It is this external perception of the Jew that will slowly creep into Nussbaum's future representations of self. Self-Portrait with the Tea Towel is the last painting in this small series. Nussbaum painting the self-portrait in 1935. An overcast sky and the attics and roofs of the Belgian city of Oostende, wherein he and Felko were hidden, form the background of the painting and Nussbaum's reality. By 1935, Nussbaum's formation of self had yet another unwanted piece of identity to contend with, that of refugee. The lack of agency and control, the unknown and loss of hope are represented by the gray clouds on the horizon and the dark maze of rooftops, at once a refuge and a prison. In this portrait, Nussbaum has positioned himself in the center of the painting. He is bare-chested and stares directly out to his audience. His expression is unreadable. The symbols Nussbaum has included continue to embed constructs of self in his work. The upturned funnel and tea towels are simple kitchen items, yet to a refugee they represent the concept of home, the luxury of owning and purchasing, and perhaps the loss of everything, even objects as simple as these. They also symbolize the Jew. Nussbaum has positioned the funnel on his head at a jaunty angle, reminiscent of an artist's beret, a dunce cap, and maybe the hats Jews were made to wear in the Middle Ages. The simple tea towel is draped over his shoulder, blue and white, like a Jewish prayer shawl. Nussbaum has not wrapped himself in the shawl. It is not unfurling over his shoulder. It is tied around his neck. His Jewish identity is now firmly in place. Nussbaum is no longer searching for his own idealized version of self. He no longer has the luxury to do so. In textualizing the body, the self-portrait renders it a sign, and thus the body becomes a metaphor in the text, standing in for something that is not there. Nussbaum's painting of self creates metaphors of the self Nussbaum saw, and the way in which the same self was seen by others. Nussbaum painted himself in the hope that others would one day see his self-portraits, but with the implicit understanding that his work would stand as a posthumous representation of Bios. Nussbaum painted the refugee in 1939, the year Germany invaded Poland and Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. The revelatory power inherent in the image invoked an ahistorical sense of human reality, be it physical or spiritual, that could be summed up in terms of the universal experience. Nussbaum had been in hiding in Belgium since 1935. He had not returned to Germany nor seen his family for years. His reality had been colored by political unrest since 1932. The devastating impact and hopelessness caused by the physical onset of war is evidenced in this painting. Nussbaum's inclusion of a bundle and a walking staff lying on the floor next to the hunched figure adds another dimension to the painting as a representation of the universal figure of the refugee. I see my The staff and bundle are a timeless, universal symbol for the world-weary traveler. Yet the bundle and staff elicit shadowy Jewish figures as well. The Israelites wandering in the desert, the timeless motif of the wandering Jew, and now the Jewish refugees of Europe. The refugee serves as a snapshot in time. It is not a self-portrait, rather a portrait of self at a specific place in time, a specific point in time where Nussbaum did not paint or could not paint his multi-dimensional self. The painting is a representation of the universal suffering of all refugees, yet it also serves as a representation of the aspect of Nussbaum's self, which is now inescapable, the powerless, wandering Jew. I'm just going to try, I see my video keeps, there we go, and my apologies. Oh, I don't know what is happening with this.
You're fine. We can hear you. It would be,
Okay.
maybe try one more time, maybe to.
I don't know why. Anyway, I'll just keep talking.
Okay.
Nussbaum painted Self-Portrait with Jewish Identity Card in 1943. He had been in hiding for almost 10 years and had been arrested and imprisoned and escaped the internment camp of Saint Cyprien. Nussbaum clearly painted this self-portrait with an audience in mind. The self Nussbaum shares with his viewers is almost unrecognizable from the strong, impetuous self portrayed in the two Jews in the interior of the Osnabrück synagogue. The painting is bleak. With the exception of a small patch of blue sky and the yellow star, the tones are almost monochromatic. An ominously dark, cloudy sky and a tall building loom over the figure of Nussbaum, the hunted Jew. Nussbaum has positioned himself at the front and center of the painting, yet he has painted himself in a corner with tall, imposing walls looming over his furtive figure. Nussbaum's expression is unreadable. His sidelong glance locks eyes with the viewer, and in his hand, he holds his own Jewish identity card. Nussbaum has repainted a replica of the self as he appears in the self-portrait of the identity card. He is the hunted Jew, the self he has been forced to recognize, yet he still holds this version of himself within his own hand. This vision of self is external. The hunted Jew is a representation of bios that was forced onto Nussbaum the man, the artist, the self-determined individual. Nussbaum the artist utilizes this portrait as a place to house the identity he was forced to recognize. But the act of representing this forced version of self truly reflects the multi-layered bios that was Felix Nussbaum. Nussbaum produced his biographical work in the form of self-portraits and portraits of self. The portrayal of himself as an artist was a conscious, central part of his identity of self. He curated his progressive representations of self within a historic context, and by doing so attempted to control the way in which he would be perceived by the consumers of his work, his audience. The slight changes in Nussbaum's features, different backgrounds, and symbolisms of the objects in the paintings seem to follow a linear progression of sorts. Felix Nussbaum's self-portrait served as a record of bios, the course of a life in which he faced a complete loss of control. Yet his portraits continue to reflect his multi-layered self and the increasingly complex reality. Nussbaum also revealed construct of his Jewish self in his work, and his self-portraits reflect the constant internal dialogue between artist and Jew. The political ramifications of rising intolerance and anti-Semitism forced Nussbaum to lose control over his external identity. He was no longer viewed as an artist. He could not be recognized for his immense talents or other attributes. He could only be perceived as the dehumanized other, the Jew. The portraiture of Felix Nussbaum is not only a metaphor of self, but a metaphor for the suffering he and others endured. The increase in the signs and symbol which signify the progressive loss of control over identity, in fact, the control over all aspects of life, become more and more evident in the paintings. The progressive changes in the images he painted reflect Nussbaum's realization that for him, the world had forever changed. The audience cannot view Nussbaum's portraits without acknowledging the historical time in which he painted. Yet his paintings continue to assert human values in defiance of Nazi efforts to strip individuals of their identities. As such, his portraits do not only serve to portray the simple representations of bios, the course of life. They are in fact a representation of bios, the essence of a life. It is this distinction between life writing as the linear progression versus life writing as a non-linear journey which informs the very essence of bios Nussbaum represented in his self-portraits. He did not have luxury of control over his environment, nor the luxury of time. He essentially painted through a time of chaos. Nussbaum was a prolific painter. The only control of voice he had was the use of self-portraits to portray self and serve as a record. By doing so, he retained control of how he would be seen by the audience. Within his self-portraits, he retained autonomy, even within the seemingly hopeless reality in which he found himself towards the end of his life. He portrayed Felix Nussbaum, not only as the persecuted Jew, but the man, the artist, the bios, the life that was Felix Nussbaum. Thank you for your time, and my apologies for all my technical glitches.